Well, shalom. My name is Todd Bennett, and this is the audio version of the weekly newsletter set forth by ShemaIsrael.net. My name is Todd Bennett, and I originally published this on day 27 of month 6 on the Creator's calendar, also known as September 24th, 2022, on the Roman calendar. Now, last week I demonstrated how we can look back in time and confirm dates and traditions using the sun and the moon according to the Torah. I also talked about the two tekufot, or rather turns, involved in the yearly cycle. Well, yesterday was the fall tekufa, also known as the fall equinox. The equinox occurred at 9:04 p.m. Eastern Standard Time Thursday night, which actually placed it in day 6 of the week according to the Hebrew reckoning. Talk about a turn. The weather in New York went from sunny 80s to wet and windy 40s and 50s, and last night it actually went down into the 30s, and that's what I call a turn, right on cue. And that demonstrates the significant role that the equinox plays in our reckoning of time and perception of the seasons. It is a turning point built into creation because it's controlled by the movements of the heavenly bodies. When we follow the signs provided in the scriptures, we see the corresponding results, like the weather changes. We see green barley appear in the month of the Aviv, and the barley does not control the calendar. It's simply the result of being on the Creator's calendar using the two great lights. And that's one of the incredible benefits of diligently obeying the commandments. We get needed confirmation and we stay on a straight path. I traveled to the land of Israel for 2 decades and saw the Creator, the calendar, confirmed by the harvest. They always fell right on time on the Creator's calendar, controlled by the sun and the moon. And when you follow the commandments, Yah is faithful to provide his promises. When we add to them and take away from them, we go astray. Well, looking to the barley before making a determination of month 1 may seem like a valid exercise. It's simply not scriptural. It's a tradition that can be tested. It can't be tested or confirmed in a way that I demonstrated in the last message. Now, people assume that since a barley offering is made during unleavened bread, we must have Aviv barley before the beginning of month 1. Well, the scriptures don't describe what Aviv barley is, and the scriptures never say that the barley controls time, and it never tells us to delegate barley inspection teams to scour the land looking for Aviv barley prior to the renewed moon. And like I said, the scriptures never define Aviv barley because the month of the Aviv is not specifically referring to barley, but rather the month when new life springs forth. In other words, spring. Therefore, the barley traditions are quite presumptuous and misleading. And we must be careful about our assumptions because they can skew our outlook on the scripture and the future plan of Elohim. Many of us have grown up in the Christian religion and carry assumptions about future prophetic events that actually derive from Jesuit deceptions. In fact, people have inherited traditions and assumptions about events preceding the return of the Messiah. They may be absolutely incorrect. The problem is that it is so ingrained they confuse the theory or idea with truth. I'm making plans to travel to Israel for Sukkot and maybe taking people to view some interesting sites. One popular tourist site is the Garden Tomb. I often take people there so that they can see an example of a tomb, but I make certain to warn them that there's no real evidence to connect that with the tomb Yeshua was placed in. I'm well aware of the Ron Wyatt claims nearby regarding the crucifixion location, but the site of the Garden Tomb is pure speculation. While the curators have developed the site into a very peaceful and tranquil setting, there is no indication that it was ever a garden in the past. And nevertheless, some people have turned it into a holy site, and thousands of sincere Christians flock there, believing it is the very spot that Yeshua was buried and later resurrected. Of course, you can witness the same thing from Orthodox Christians at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The word sepulchre means a tomb or a burial place, and this is the traditional site dating back to the 4th century CE that includes the location of the crucifixion, the anointing of the body, and the location of the tomb. In this case, there is no tomb, only a sepulchre that was constructed to commemorate the presumed spot. In either case, the locations contemplate the burial of Yeshua after his death. The King Messiah was falsely accused by his own people, then sentenced to death. He was tortured, harangued, and brutally executed on a stake. His body was then hurriedly taken down from the stake, anointed, wrapped, and sealed in an unmarked cave. And here is the account of that event. It says, later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Yeshua. Now Joseph was a disciple of Yeshua, but secretly, because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Yeshua at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Yeshua's body, the two of them wrapped it with spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial customs. At the place where Yeshua was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid, because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Yeshua there. There's no fanfare or extravagant ceremony. In fact, other than the two witnesses to this burial, namely Joseph and Nicodemus, there's no mention of anyone else to honor the king when he was laid to rest. Now, contrast that to the recent funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. You see, I was up at 4:30 a.m. Monday morning when I was in Texas earlier this week doing some writing when I received a notification on my phone that her funeral was about to begin. I decided to turn on the television and watch since it was a historic event. Now, the first hymn really got my attention because I'd been trying to remember the name for over 2 years since I started my move to Texas. And in fact, where we had our RV park, the church in the Presidio nearby played the song on the bells every night. And I remembered singing it when I was a kid in church. And I asked people, and my daughter looked up on the internet and tried to do a search, and no one could figure out the name of it. And not even the people at the church. My daughter actually contacted them and said, what is the name of that song that you play? And they didn't even know. So when I tuned in and heard it, I couldn't believe it. The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended. That's the name of the hymn. And I thought, finally, mystery solved. Thank you, Queen Elizabeth. Of course, by then I was listening to the hymn and I was remembering the words. And so I continued to watch, and I was struck by all of the precision and the detail that went into this dramatically choreographed event. It's probably the most elaborate funeral I have seen in my lifetime. I remember the funeral of President Ronald Reagan, which was certainly expensive and grand, but it paled in scale and scope to the pomp and pageantry of the Queen's funeral, which was actually a military operation dubbed Operation London Bridge. It's my understanding that the Queen herself worked on the plans for decades, since the 1960s, which makes you wonder what it would have looked like if she hadn't planned it that long. Would people have put that much attention into her funeral if she had not choreographed it herself? Well, the monarch obviously wanted it to be elaborate. She left instructions for her followers, and she definitely got what she wanted. You could see that those who watched and participated were very sincere in their devotion and admiration of the Queen. And I'm glad that I watched it because it's not something that you see every day, especially in America, where we revolted against this very monarchy centuries ago. Despite America's origins in dealing with a tyrannical monarchy, it has ultimately fallen prey to greedy, self-interested politicians and is currently in a state of serious decline and collapse as we speak. America was a grand experiment, but it relied on a morally sound and fiercely independent populace that was willing to fight and protect their freedoms. Currently, the United States has become polarized into special interest groups and factions, all seeking their piece of the pie. Forgotten are the founding principles of free speech, free and independent press, and unfettered gun ownership. Now, only politically correct speech is tolerated. Everything else gets censored by the majority of the media outlets that are aligned with the technocratic beast system that is engulfing the planet. The next big move is to take away the guns so that the population can become completely subjugated and unable to resist. The United States of America is no longer united, and America is a faint whisper of what it was meant to be because it has lost its course. The states have succumbed to the power of the ever-increasing federal government, which has literally become a hammer that will beat its populace into submission and bleed them dry in order to grow in power and spend itself into oblivion. The federal government then carries that hammer throughout the world to beat other nations into submission for their resources. The land of the free and the home of the brave is quickly becoming the land of the slaves and home of the overtaxed and exhausted masses, at least the ones who are not feeding at the government trough. Well, it happens to every republic, and it was inevitable to occur with this republic. And that's why I've long held that I would rather have a righteous king rule over me than an elected politician. Sadly, an examination of the history of Israel, as provided through 1 Kings, 2 Kings, as well as 1 and 2 Chronicles, reveals that the odds are against us there as well. Incredibly, Yahuwah was originally the king of Israel, but the people weren't satisfied. They wanted a king like the nations around them. Now, this is not a surprise. Yahuwah foretold this would happen through Moses, and we read that in Deuteronomy 17. It says, "When you come to the land which Yahuwah your Elohim is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom Yahuwah your Elohim chooses, one from among your brethren. You shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother." They went the entire span of the judges without a king. The Israelites coexisted as separate and independent tribes, and they were supposed to stay unified through the appointed times by gathering at the house of Yahuwah 3 times a year. They would come and pay homage to their king at his palace, or should I say his tent. And that says a lot about the difference between the kings of kingdoms of man and the kings of this world and the king of the universe who chose a tent to dwell in. The problem is that people stopped going to meet the king. And just prior to the birth of Shemuel, we read the following. Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim, Zophim, of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. This man went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to Yahuwah of hosts in Shiloh. Also, the sons of Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas, the priests of Yahuwah, were there. Now, the continuing account reveals that the priesthood and the tabernacle were corrupted. The sons of the high priest Eli were profaning the offerings that people presented and stealing, actually, part of the offerings that didn't belong to them, and Eli did not stop them. The people didn't want to make offerings that would be stolen and defiled, and so the numbers ended up dwindling, which resulted in separation from each other and separation from Yahuwah. And we can see that the state of Israel was in serious decline at that time. As a result, Yahuwah called Shemuel as a child to serve him. He allowed his Mishkan, which was a modified, more permanent tabernacle, to be abandoned. His ark was taken by the Philistines, and the sons of Eli were both killed. Shiloh eventually became desolate, and some believe that it was destroyed by the Philistines. That was an abomination of desolation event, by the way. Just like there is not one day of the Lord event in the future. I always grew up thinking, well, the day of the Lord, that was, a future event. But there's many events in the scriptures that would be classified as the day of the Lord or day of Yahweh. And mainly they're just judgment events that occurred. When he calls down his judgment and he says enough is enough, the day of the Yahweh is when he metes out his judgment on a people or a nation. Well, the same holds true with the mysterious abomination of desolation that many mistakenly place in the future. There were abominations of desolation in the past, and the abomination of desolation event spoken of by Yeshua occurred in 70 CE, when the Romans later destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And there was an abomination of desolation that we read about in Maccabees, when the pig was slain at the altar and the temple was defiled. That was prophesied through Daniel. Now, failure to understand that what this is going to get you into all sorts of trouble when it comes to understanding the prophecies of the future. See, that 70 CE abomination of desolation, many people think Yeshua was referring to our future. And so now all of a sudden, there's got to be another temple, and there has to be all these things that happen. So that's why we see people, getting into the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer, and finding the Ark of the Covenant and rebuilding the temple, because they think all these things have to happen, and they just neglect the fact that Yeshua is prophesying about a future event for that temple, and it happened. It happened in 70 CE. Well, back to our story here. Shemuel ended up being the last judge. He ended up going out to the people, and his life provides many patterns for Messiah Yeshua. It's particularly poignant that he was the prophet who oversaw the transition of Israel to a king. Here's the account. It says, "Now it came to pass, when Shemuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Shemuel at Ramah and said to him, 'Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us all, like all the nations.' But the thing displeased Shemuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' So Shemuel prayed to Yahweh. And Yahweh said to Shemuel, 'Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods. So they're doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them, and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them.' So Shemuel told all the words of Yahweh to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, 'This will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over his thousands and captains over his 50s. Will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants, and you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and Yahweh will not hear you in that day.' Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Shemuel, and they said, 'No, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.' And Shemuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of Yahweh. So Yahweh said to Shemuel, 'Heed their voice and make them a king.' Even though Yahweh was their king, his physical priests had failed to properly represent him in the past. And while Shemuel judged righteously, they did not want anything to do with his sons. And despite the fact that Yahweh warned them they would be oppressed by their king, the people still wanted a man. The desire was deemed to be wicked by Yahweh, again, because they were rejecting him. Now, read the account when the first king named Saul was anointed as king. Now, therefore, stand and see this great thing which Yahweh will do before your eyes. Is today not the wheat harvest? I will call to Yahweh, and he will send thunder and rain, that you may perceive and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of Yahweh, in asking a king for yourselves. So Shemuel called to Yahweh, and Yahweh sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared Yahweh and Shemuel. And all the people said to Shemuel, pray for your servants to Yahweh your Elohim, that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins the evil of asking a king for ourselves. Then Shemuel said to the people, do not fear, you have done all this wickedness, yet do not turn aside from following Yahweh, but serve Yahweh with all your heart. And do not turn aside, for then you would go after empty things, which cannot profit or deliver, for they are nothing. For Yahweh will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased Yahweh to make you his people. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against Yahweh in ceasing to pray for you, but I will teach you the good and the right way. Only fear Yahweh and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king. Well, now that's what I call climate change. It doesn't rain during the wheat harvest, and the people knew it. Yahweh was not happy with them again, because it was a rejection of him. Well, they got what they asked for. The first king, although he looked the part, he was tall and handsome, ended up being a failure. The second king, David, although flawed, was a king who was zealous for Yahweh and sought righteousness. Sadly, his son and the majority of the kings who followed in the house of Judah and the house of Israel were evil or did evil. From a reading of the scriptures, it appears that in the combined kingdoms, only 39 kings and one queen. Out of that many, arguably only 5 of them were really righteous. You could argue for 2 or 3 more who were mixed, but think about those odds. Not very good. The problem is they got sloppy and they acted like the kings of the other nations. The kings of Israel were given specific instructions to make them set apart from other kings. We already mentioned that the king was not to be a foreigner. That's because foreigners served false gods and would not be rooted in the covenant. The king needed to be circumcised on the 8th day and raised within the covenant. Here are some additional commandments directed specifically at kings. He shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, for Yahweh has said to you, you shall not return that way again, neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this Torah in a scroll for the one before the priests, from the one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his Elohim, and be careful to observe all the words of this Torah and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Well, all of these commandments for kings were intended to keep them humble and focused on the covenant path. Imagine having a king who actually did these things, a king who studied the Torah and focused on Yahweh continually, a king who diligently obeyed the commandments. While Solomon was given wisdom, he chose to disobey these commandments, and his actions caused the kingdom to be divided. The king of Israel was not supposed to accumulate many wives. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The king of Israel was not to accumulate wealth, yet he had exceedingly great wealth and actually taxed the people into submission to the point where they revolted. The king of Israel was not supposed to have horses and chariots like Pharaoh in order to project pride and power. He was supposed to ride a donkey. That would demonstrate that the king was a humble servant who relied upon the power of Elohim. Well, the scriptures record, now Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Well, we don't know if Solomon ever obeyed the commandment to write his own Torah scroll. It appears not. Even if he did, it doesn't seem like he read it every day, because he definitely did not diligently obey the commandments for kings. While these specific commandments were directed to a king of Israel, we are all commanded to diligently keep the commands and diligently obey the voice of Yahweh. Last week I quoted Exodus 15:26 when I was opening up the United in Yah Health event. It reads, "If you diligently heed the voice of Yahweh, your Elohim, and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh who heals you." Now notice the if-then relationship. Obedience to the terms of the covenant was a condition to receiving the benefits of the covenant. This is perfectly reasonable. If you look in the Hebrew, you will read shamar shamar or shema shema in certain passages requiring diligence. Yah does not stutter. He repeats himself to emphasize the importance of the matter, and the translators understood that so they would add the word diligent to emphasize the point. And you can see that in Deuteronomy 6:17 and Deuteronomy 28:1 if you look in the Hebrew. Remember when we talked about the fact that perfect peace in Isaiah 26:3 is shalom, shalom? Well, Yahweh wants us to not only have perfect peace, shalom, shalom, he wants us to perfectly hear, shema, shema, and perfectly keep, shamar, shamar, the commandments. We all have been exposed to what I call greasy grace in our Christian walks, but Yahweh demands perfection. I was working on chapter 19 of the Leaving Babylon book. I'm getting there before I tuned into the Queen's funeral earlier this week, and that chapter is all about understanding renewal in the covenant journey. And I discussed how Noah was described as perfect in his generation. We read that in Genesis 6:9. We too should be perfect in our generation if we want to serve Elohim. Yahweh specifically provides, "My eyes shall be on the faithful of the land, that they may dwell with me. He who walks in a perfect way, he shall serve me." Here's what we should be proclaiming every day. I will behave wisely in a perfect way. Oh, when will you come to me? I will walk within my house with a perfect heart. The word for perfect is tamim. It doesn't mean that you never made a mistake or sinned, as most Westerners view the word perfect. It means blameless and unblemished. It's the condition we should all find ourselves after being washed and covered by the blood of Messiah. Sadly, so many Christians plead the blood and then go continue in sin because they refuse to obey the Torah, or they've been taught that they don't have to obey the Torah. Yeshua shed his blood to cleanse us, and the point is to stay clean. And the way that we stay clean is by being washed by the water of the Word. In other words, we read and hear the Word. We then let it flow in and through us and out of us by our righteous actions. When we remain in obedience, we walk perfectly before Elohim. This is a hallmark of his covenant people. Remember what Yahweh instructed Abram when he changed his name to Abraham before the covenant of circumcision? It says, when Abram was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. That word blameless is tamim. And I will make my covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly. So there's that word again, tamim. It was a requirement of the covenant, and it still is. Yahweh never changed his mind regarding what he was looking for in a covenant people. He even sent his son to heal them and cleanse them. He then sent the Spirit to empower them. So people today have absolutely no excuse for not walking before Elohim and being blameless. Sadly, not many Christians are taught to be perfect. In fact, most churches are like going to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. When they stand up and describe themselves as an alcoholic, even when they've overcome the addiction and been set free, how many Christians describe themselves as sinners even after they've supposedly been set free by Jesus? Talk about a negative confession. No wonder so many Christians are enslaved by sin. They've never been taught the definition of sin and the definition of righteousness as found in the Torah. Or they've been told it doesn't apply to them. So they wander through life, falling into sin, but because they don't even know the definition of sin. They think that the instructions of righteousness are inapplicable to their lives. Well, you have to know them in order to repent, and if you've actually repented and turned from your sinful ways, been cleansed by the blood of Yeshua, and are walking with Elohim and following his righteous instructions, you are no longer a Gentile. You are no longer a sinner. You're no longer a pagan. You are Yisrael. And that's why the appointed times are keyed to the tekufot, or the turns. They remind us to turn, repent to Yahweh, and walk perfectly before him. They remind us to meet with him and serve him. Through the work of Yeshua and the filling of the set-apart Spirit, you can walk perfect before Yahweh. The question is whether you will put it in. Whether you'll put in the effort. So this brings me back to the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. When I watched it, I was enthralled at the precision and, dare I say, perfection. I was watching intently at every detail, looking for a mistake, and I'm sure there were mistakes, but from my view, it was flawless. And I'll be honest with you, after the conclusion of the event, I was overwhelmed with emotion, and not because the Queen was dead, but by the fact that Yahweh expects that type of service from us. If people can put that level of diligence and perfection into serving a deceased queen, what should we be doing for the living Elohim, the King of the universe? Now, that's something to really consider and ponder, and I've been thinking about it all week. Do we put any effort into our service, or do we simply go through the motions? I wonder if any of those people involved in the Queen's funeral considered the contrast and would be willing to apply the same effort to serving Yahweh. Now, yesterday I met with some elders of a local church that are going through a split, and they were so saddened about the decrease in numbers. I reminded them that numbers don't matter. It's the quality of the servants and whether they bear fruit. They were concerned about the fact that their pastor resigned, but I reminded them that their fellowship is about a community, and there are 7 days in a week. It's not just about listening to a man for half an hour on Sunday. It's about walking with Elohim every day. The focus is not on a man. It is on Yahweh. Again, 7 days a week. It just goes to show how desperately people want to follow a man when they really need to set their eyes on Yahweh. Last week I watched thousands of sincere Brits express their love and devotion toward a royal family that actually changed their name to Windsor 100 years ago because their real name, Saxe Coburg Gotha, sounded too German. Of course, that's because it was German. Indeed, the father of King Charles III was from the Danish-German house of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glucksburg. So there's German through his mother and his father. And interestingly, lineage for a British king who was this is interesting lineage for a British king who was circumcised by a Jewish rabbi, by the way. Nevertheless, most people don't look behind the curtain. They just want a king to rule over them like the Israelites. It's amazing how people are so quick to follow, adore, and even worship a man when we already have a king, Messiah Yeshua. And even when they went through all the motions of reading scriptures at the funeral and exalting Jesus and all that, their adoration was really towards an earthly monarch. And, over the years, I've been amazed at people who looked to Donald Trump, President Trump, as a savior, and they still do. For what I've seen and witnessed, he does not seem to know the scriptures, and certainly didn't write his own Torah scroll. He's accumulated great wealth, and I certainly cannot see him riding a donkey. He's actually the antithesis of humility. Honestly, all of this, looking at men and leaders, is a huge Babylonian distraction, especially because I know a king who did ride on a donkey. And if you're in the kingdom of Elohim, then Yahuwah is your king, and we look forward to the coronation and installment of his son on this planet. Yahuwah and his son are both kings of different kingdoms. Yahuwah rules the heavens, and Yeshua will rule in this physical realm. Did you know that Yom Teruah was the day when the reigns of the kings of Judah were reckoned from? Remember that the coronation date is different from an ascension date. A king or queen descends to the throne upon the death of the reigning monarch. The coronation usually takes place months later, after the mourning is concluded. For consistency's sake, Judah used Yom Teruah as the controlling date for their monarchs. That's why Yeshua was born on Yom Teruah, and likely anointed by the wise men when he was a child on that date a couple years later. We're now just days away from Yom Teruah, which will begin after sunset on Tuesday, September 27, 2022, and will continue until sunset Wednesday, September 28, 2022. How interesting that many are anticipating the coronation of King Charles III now that Queen Elizabeth II has been laid to rest. And I've encouraged people to watch that coronation ceremony closely because I believe it all has prophetic significance. The service will hearken back to Solomon and Zadok, and the scepter and orb represent the rule of Jesus over the earth. The throne that he will sit upon includes the stone of scone, claimed to be the stone that Jacob laid on at Bethel. The British monarchy has both a military and a religious element to it, and the House of Windsor also claims a direct link to King David. This led to the belief in British Israelism. The Masonic symbolism is everywhere with this monarchy, and if you have eyes to see, so the prophetic implications and possibilities are all quite profound. With King Charles III being one of the founders of the World Economic Forum and one of the chief architects of the Great Reset, we're sure to see him working hard to complete the beast system. So stay tuned for the next episode of Babylon Rising. In the meantime, it's important that we maintain our focus on honoring our coming king. We should focus on diligent obedience and perfecting our walk and our service. It's no coincidence that Israel was described as an army when leaving Egypt, and the entire process of camping and marching through the wilderness was like a military operation. Of course, Israel was the army of Yahuwah. They went into battle with their king leading them. A good military is defined by its discipline, and discipline is required for perfect service. When the trumpet sounds on Yom Teruah, will you be ready to serve the king with oil in your lamps, or will you be caught sleeping and unprepared? As we patiently wait for the bridegroom, remember the words of the psalm that we previously stated. I will behave wisely in a perfect way. Oh, when will you come to me? I will walk within my house with a perfect heart. These times call for wisdom as we long for the return of our righteous King. Barakot. My name is Todd Bennett from ShemaIsrael.net. Shalom.